Hi, this is Lou, and this is the longer version of the design notes for the recent reissue of Britannia. The shorter version will be a talking head and much less detail. So this is the classic or 2.5 edition. It's not a third edition because the rules have not changed. Let me repeat, the rules have not changed. I think I even wrote in the rules, although I don't know if it got in the final draft, if you think the rules have changed, you're wrong after you read the rules. But there are many physical changes. That includes plastic armies and leaders and a new interface. Also, the package includes a second standalone game, Duel Britannia, for 2 players up to 90 minutes. And this package was all released in late August 2020. It can be ordered on PSC Games UK website. They do have American fulfillment, but I think when it reaches online US stores and even US game shops, it's going to be less expensive than it is from PSC. There's, among other things, a 17.5% value-added tax that's added into the price on all UK goods. So how did this originate? Well, the Fantasy Flight Games edition of Britannia, the second edition, sold out its second printing in 2012, and they weren't interested in a second reprint. At that point, I think it was selling about 400 copies a year, and that was not sufficient because the game was a trophy game for them. The owner liked Britannia. The owner lived in Denmark for many years, and so he wanted to publish Britannia even though it didn't fit their line otherwise. Well, by then I was working on the third edition, which this new one is not. Keep in mind, this is something else. There are actually 3 third edition standalone games being designed by me. One is Conquer Britannia, which is 6 turns and takes less than 2 hours. It is 4 players, and it starts after the Romans have left Britain. And of course it has its own board, and it's designed to work with plastic pieces and so on. Then there's Rule Britannia, which is 9 turns. It includes Ireland, and it's diceless. The combat is done with cards. Then there's Epic Britannia, which is the changed version of the original game, and it's changed fairly substantially. But for some reasons, I let these games lie fallow and worked on others and haven't worked on any of them in several years. Maybe they'll be published in a few years. The Epic version of the third edition is a better teaching tool, which some people would say is more realistic, but it could be slightly longer because there are more constraints on the players. Now, included in that is a quicker freeform version for 2 to 5 that actually works for all those numbers but is less historical. So in this edition, the reissue or the classic edition, we have plastic figures. For a long time I was skeptical of plastic figures for the big game, though I always used plastic with Conquer and Rule Britannia, and there are many fewer pieces, of course. But finally I came around to the idea that it would be necessary because that's the way gaming is going. Presentation becomes more and more valuable as time passes. So this required a publisher who has plastic figure expertise. Many of them do not, especially those who are interested in publishing what amounts to a war game. Now I hear that some people are painting the plastic 18mm figures, and I had never imagined that. But I'm not a figure painter myself. It has an improved interface. A defect of the old interface was a player had to ask for another player's nation card when that player wanted to see the opposing victory point locations. It kind of gave things away a little bit. Now each player has a large card showing all the scoring for all the players. It could also be awkward to see when new units arrived in the old editions. Now each player has a card with all the appearance and so on information on it. And there are no nation cards. So this is better in most respects. And the only respect that it's not is players don't have a separate nation card to put their separate pieces for that nation on. So PSC Games in England have long made plastic miniatures for miniatures war games in the UK. You may be aware that when somebody in the UK says war games, they often mean miniatures, whereas when somebody in the United States says war games, they usually mean board games. Just one of those things. Miniatures war games is perhaps stronger in the UK than in the United States. I met the owner at WBC one year. He just got into publishing board war games. A year or two later, I contracted with him for 2 games, but they later got Kickstarter disease. That is, they were unwilling to publish a new game that didn't appeal to Kickstarter denizens, meaning short, simple, dumbed down, and quote-unquote, oh shiny. More about visuals than about the game. So they canceled both contracts. Yes, that happens, and yes, they can. The designer cannot, but the publisher can. Now, of course, Britannia is not a typical Kickstarter game, but it has a long history behind it and an existing fan base, and so it got past their Kickstarter disease. Well, when this happened, I was coming to England anyway, and I had planned to meet them, so I did anyway. Although my wife said, if I recall correctly, why are you going to bother? But they're good guys, and I wanted to find out what was going on, see what else I could do for them. So somewhere during several hours with them, I said, I should have gotten Brit reprinted soon after it went out of print. And in hindsight, that's true. 2012 is when it went out of print. It certainly could have been reprinted much sooner than we have had happen, although who knows, we've got the upgrade to plastic pieces with this. Well, the next day, they sent me a letter, or an email rather, and offered to reissue Britannia with plastic figures and with a second 2-player kind of introductory 90-minute game that I would design. And I'd tried 2-player games with the Brit set, and it was way too dependent on the dice. So I designed Duel Britannia in the next year. This is one of 2 of my published games that originated with someone else's idea, and both have turned out very well. They wanted me to design a game that more or less used Britannia methods for 2 players that was playable in 90 minutes. I chose to use a new board because I needed fewer areas, and that's printed on the other side of the Britannia board. Dragon Rage 2nd edition in 2011 had shown me that 2-sided boards are quite practical. Now, I have made separate design notes for this game, which have appeared on my game design channel, and I will link them on my website sooner or later. So to get back to Britannia itself, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, as the saying goes, including a big advance. And the Kickstarter was in July 2019. Publication was much delayed by the pandemic. But the Kickstarter backers began getting their copies in August, and I got mine on the 3rd of September. And by now, everyone should have got their copies. Now there's some notes about the board. I think using a scoring track for Britannia is a bad idea. In a highly competitive 4 to 5 hour game, scoring markers are going to get knocked about. It's just about inevitable. I talked Fantasy Flight out of using a track in 2006, but I failed here. Everyone I know, just as in the first edition, uses a score sheet, and they always have, because that's the way it was in the first edition. The other thing about the board, which is otherwise very nice, is it's not so easy to see some of the borders, especially in Scotland. And I tried to get them to address this in the draft, and I think they did, but as soon as my wife saw this version of it, she said, no, they haven't done as much as they needed to do. Fortunately, the dual board is clearer. There will be an electronic version of Britannia, or should be, available in 2021. There will be a Kickstarter. You may also see plastic fort photos. Those are Kickstarter only. They are cardboard in the main set, 1-inch square pieces, so they're still very nice, but they're not plastic. Cardboard armies were only available to Kickstarter supporters at additional cost. They are round, large pieces. I would like to see wooden laser cut pieces made available, but we'll see. What about expansions? The package has to sell well enough to warrant expansions, of course. I currently have 2 versions of, believe it or not, Zombie Britannia. One is a fairly quick co-op for 3, 4, 5 players. The other is used with the competitive full game, which of course makes it all longer, where the players can use cards to cause the zombies to do things, presumably to their enemies. And there are lots of possibilities aside from that, but once again, the game must sell well first. I have some other Britannia-like games that could be published, and I even have a freeform Britannia in outer space, which works really well and is about ready to publish. So I improved the game, that is to say the interface, without changing the rules. If you know the second edition, you can play this immediately, and you can replace your old copy as well. Thanks for listening.